Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So I was reading this article, and it was titled, the Federal Reserve said it could inject $2.3 trillion into the markets, into the lending, or of liquidity into markets, but it hasn't even come close yet. At least the title was something similar to that. It was very close. And this isn't surprising. The Federal Reserve has established new lending facilities. These are lending facilities to inject liquidity into just about every corner of the credit markets out there, from corporate bonds to municipal bonds to small businesses, asset-backed securities, U.S. treasuries, mortgages. No matter where it is that credit is flowing, the Federal Reserve has a lending facility to basically back it up. And the whole idea is to keep lending markets or credit markets properly functioning. Now, in my opinion, properly functioning means that if you have an issue with paying off your debt, then interest rates rise. But the Federal Reserve doesn't see it that way. See, the Federal Reserve says if there is trouble with getting liquidity out there because investors are not are demanding higher interest rates, so to speak, in order to lend out that money, then they're going to step in and provide that liquidity since the investors aren't going to be there to do it. That's not proper functioning. That's the Federal Reserve manipulating. All right. But setting all that aside, what is really taking place here is that the Federal Reserve is using credible threats. Now, I have a lot of new subscribers over the last few days. I really appreciate all the new subscriptions to the channel. Thank you very much, guys. And to get you up to speed, because if you have been watching The Uneducated Economist for any length of time, we have talked a lot about something called credible threats. Now, credible threats, I got this from a Ben Bernanke speech back in 2001, because way back then the Federal Reserve knew that they were eventually going to run into the lower bound. And the lower bound is zero interest rates, where they were not going to be able to drop interest rates any farther in order to stimulate the economy. Typically, the Federal Reserve would want to drop interest rates around 5% in order to kind of spark new debt out there, to get people out there like taking out new car loans and house loans and using their credit cards in order to go on vacation and stuff like that. This is how the Federal Reserve typically would try and stimulate the economy. That's monetary policy. But they knew that this time around that they were not going to have that kind of room. They were not going to be able to drop interest rates that 5% like they would typically expect to do during a recession. But Ben Bernanke knew that this was not going to be a problem, that they could use something called credible threats. And the way he described credible threats was with the little story of a guy who invents a gold machine. And with this gold machine, he could produce as much gold at will with very little cost or energy. The moment that this information got out to the markets that this guy had this gold machine, the price of gold on the market would plummet immediately, would just drop, even before the guy produces a single ounce of gold. Just the credible threat alone would be enough to move the markets. And that's what the Federal Reserve is using for their monetary policy right now, is credible threats. So they set up all these lending facilities. They got the Treasury to back them up. They did a little bit of participation in the lending facilities just to prove that they were there, to add more credibility to it. And the investors tried to front run them. When they said, hey, we're going to step into the corporate debt market, all of a sudden, all the corporations had all the investors they needed buying up all their corporate debt. And the Federal Reserve hardly participated at all. I mean, they did a few $1 billion, which seems like a lot of money, but they did not even come close to the amount of money that they could have participated in. See, the investors were like, they said, the Federal Reserve, they're stepping into the corporate debt market. Better get some corporate debt before they get in there. Because once those interest rates drop, we're going to be able to sell our corporate debt that we have purchased ahead of the Fed to the Federal Reserve for profit. That was the whole intention the Federal Reserve had, was to convince the markets that they were going to do this. And it worked. And it's working even today. And Jerome Powell has even stated that, the mere talking about buying into corporate debt has loosened up the corporate debt market, providing all the liquidity they needed, considering that the investors are trying to front run them. And that's all they're doing right now. Now, I'm not saying that they couldn't, say in the future, go ahead and start adding that liquidity in, that 2.3 trillion that they could possibly do. But as of right now, they're hardly participating at all with these lending facilities. And now, one of the other articles I was reading was questioning why it is that credit card interest rates are not dropping with, like, say, mortgage rates or the U.S. Treasuries, because typically, like, especially the 10-year Treasury, wherever the interest rates on that go, all interest rates on all loans go. So if the 10-year Treasury is dropping, mortgages are dropping, auto loans are dropping, credit cards are dropping, everything follows the 10-year. But right now, we do not see credit card interest rates dropping. And there was a question, why is that? Delinquencies on credit cards are historically low, which is true. If you go and you look at a chart for like the last 20, 30 years, you're going to see that credit card delinquencies are historically low. Like, very few people are delinquent on their credit cards. But if you go and you look at a chart of the last 5 years, you're going to see an increase in delinquencies of around 30%. So if you're a company that issues out credit cards and you're issuing out credit cards during a time when there's a 30% increase in delinquencies, even if it's historically low, that is a very concerning situation. So it's no surprise to me that we do not see interest rates on credit cards dropping, especially during a time of like recession, because people are going to spend money on that credit card and not be able to pay it back. And that is a very dangerous situation to be in, especially if you are the issuer of the credit cards. Anyway, I'll leave links down in the description for you guys. Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.